Teachers in Alberta are pissed. So I asked one, what are you pissed about?
Oh man, how much time do you have?
Growing class sizes, stagnant salaries, working overtime, but most of all, they're pissed about one thing.
Bill 2 is passed.
Shame! Order!
In early October, over 50,000 teachers went on strike. And a couple weeks ago, Danielle Smith and the UCP government used the Notwithstanding Clause to order them back to work.
The vibes are bad, amongst the staff. Morale is pretty low. Everyone's feeling pretty frustrated.
That's Elizabeth, and Elizabeth teaches humanities in South Central Alberta. We're not using her real name because she is worried about the repercussions, and even though it might not sound like it, she normally really likes her job.
First of all, I like feeling like I'm doing a public service, if that makes sense. I like feeling like I'm contributing to society in some way by educating the next generation.
For Elizabeth, the days since being forced back to work have been really tough.
Charter rights being taken away has been really difficult to come to terms with. I am no longer doing any work outside of my contracted hours. So I show up 10 minutes before, 15 minutes before, and I leave 10 or 15 minutes after. I don't do any more work. So I did that this morning. I showed up 20 minutes early to print some stuff for my first class. The idea was that I was going to print a worksheet, have them work on it for 20 minutes while I figured something else out for the rest of the block. My computer wouldn't connect to the printer. The bell was ringing. I just lost it. I was like, what am I supposed to do? So I just lost my mind. I started crying in the office, and the secretary was like, what do you need? And I was like, I can't print anything. And she's like, send it to me, I'll print it. So she printed it, and then the AP went and covered my class while I hyperventilated in the office. And it's just been a day.
When Alberta's back to work law faced a constitutional challenge, Premier Danielle Smith reached to the absolute bottom of the bag for one of the most powerful tools in Canadian politics to override our sacred charter and keep teachers in the classroom. Here's Alberta's education minister talking about it.
Our students have been out of school for 3 weeks. There are clear studies that demonstrate that such closures and prolonged outages will negatively impact, it's not a question of if, but will negatively impact students academically, socially, and psychologically. As Minister of Education and Childcare, I cannot allow a circumstance to continue that hurts the well-being of children and our students. And so students must return to the classroom as quickly as possible. That's why our government has implemented this measure.
Although Elizabeth is pissed, she was not surprised by Smith's move.
In my view, it seems like they are hell-bent on dismantling public education. It's the classic break the system from within and then say, well, it's broken, so we have to fundamentally change the entire system.
And I thought that might be dramatic, but Elizabeth pointed me in the direction of an op-ed Smith wrote in 2018 called, quote, "Maybe we need to defund public schools," unquote. Now, to me, it seems like there's a lot of strikes that are getting squashed recently.
Now, postal workers have been ordered to return to work tomorrow, ending a strike that's lasted a month during the busiest time of the year for deliveries.
The government has been left with no choice but to take immediate action today. And that's why we introduced the Keeping Students in Class Act.
Certainly a lot of activity happening here at Terminal 1 at Pearson Airport. Now, the Canada Industrial Relations Board today declared this strike illegal.
Back to work for thousands of rail employees across the country after the Federal Labor Board ordered a halt to the 3-day work stoppage.
Across Canada, governments are shutting down strikes with laws and court orders, and now the Notwithstanding Clause. Could this playbook undermine labor movements all across the country? This episode, I am talking to Dr. Jason Foster. Jason likes to say his area of study is work. He is a professor of labor relations at Athabasca University, and he was once the director of policy analysis at the Alberta Federation of Labor. That is the group now attempting to organize a general strike in support of the teachers. Let's get into it. Dr. Foster, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
Why did the teachers strike in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, I think this has actually been a dispute that's been a long time coming. Obviously, like every other sort of worker in Canada, they went through the difficulties of COVID, and then, of course, high inflation, where their wages didn't keep up, much like the rest of us. And what, for them, a particular issue was basically our schools and our classrooms have become much more challenging. So for them, their biggest priorities were class sizes, trying to get some language in their collective agreement to try and bring down the size of classes, and to get more resources into the classroom to deal with classroom complexity. So those were very clearly their two issues. They've been sort of bargaining for over a year on this. The teachers turned down a mediator's report and a tentative agreement that their union had negotiated for them earlier in the summer.
We went directly to our teachers and asked them. Their response, the resounding and historical no that you have before you today. The proposed agreement failed to meet the needs of teachers, failed to improve student classroom conditions in a concrete and meaningful way, and failed to show teachers the respect they deserve.
Just couldn't find a common ground on a lot of these core issues, and we found ourselves in a strike earlier this month.
Right. So what I'm hearing is that they're two kind of separate issues that was part of this labor dispute. There was the salary, and then there was the classroom supports. So I want to talk about the salary really quick. They got a 12% pay raise for the teachers over 4 years until August 2028.
The ATA wants more money than we're prepared to offer them. And part of the reason we have offered 12% is we think it's fair. We know it puts them well above others in the Western provinces, and we need the dollars to hire more teachers and more education assistants.
The government says that this is the biggest wage increase anyone has seen in 2 decades.
Well, it may be, but the only reason it's unprecedented is because the last 10 to 15 years, teachers and other public sector workers' wages have been suppressed. In the last 10 years, teachers got a grand total of a 5.75% pay increase. In that time, inflation has gone up almost 25%. So they've lost 20% over the last decade in terms of their purchasing power. When you think about the last 10 years, it's still not helping them catch up to where they were a decade ago.
So then the other half of this is the classroom support. The province offered 3,000 more teaching positions. The Alberta Teachers Association says that's not enough. They said they needed 5,000 new teachers and more classroom support for class size and complexity of the teaching. I talked to a teacher in Alberta that said the salary is not the issue why she's striking. It is the classroom supports.
My answer kind of changed during the strike. So at the beginning of the strike, my personal view was, well, if they're not going to do anything about classrooms, if they're not going to make our jobs better, at least pay us more for the labor that we're doing. Like if I'm doing double the labor, give me more money. You know what I mean? However, as the strike went on and as it became clear that the government was hell-bent on disrespecting us at every single turn, just seeing the disrespect of the government towards us as a profession, it actually kind of flipped me by the end. So towards the end, I was thinking, if they were to offer us 0 in salary increases, but they were going to invest enough money to address the situations in our classroom, I would actually be in favor of that.
So it seems like this is the galvanizing issue for a lot of teachers in the province.
It is. And then that clearly is what led them to this strike. I mean, teachers don't have a long history in Alberta, don't have a big history of striking. Their one and only other strike before this was 2002. And it also was over class sizes. So you can sort of see a thread here. And I think the reason that, what the government has put up on offer is inadequate in the teacher's mind is because it's like kind of a little bit like a too little too late, right? There's been a chronic underfunding of the public education system in Alberta since 2019. So when you've got 6 years of underfunding that's been compiling and with significant population growth, we've also seen significant in-migration to Alberta in these last few years. You combine those two things and you basically have classrooms bursting at the seams. And so the teachers know that, sure, 3,000 extra teachers, a couple thousand more educational assistants are going to help, but they don't necessarily get us to a point where we were, 7, 8, or 10 years ago.
And the Alberta government begged for more migration. I mean, I was living in Toronto in the time and I saw so many ads for come to Alberta.
Hey, Toronto. Thinking about moving out of Ontario? Why not consider Alberta? If you're thinking about moving, Alberta is definitely worth considering. It also has some of Canada's most stunning scenery.
Alberta is calling. Learn more at albertaiscalling.ca.
So were they just not planning on supporting the influx of new students, or was it just mismanagement on their part?
I think it was just largely it was just short-term thinking, right? They thought, isn't it so clever, right, to start this campaign, try and encourage, interprovincial migration. Alberta's calling. It's so clever. They sort of patted themselves on the back for how clever they were in the short term, right? And they just didn't simply think about the longer term consequences.
A teacher we spoke to said that schools in Alberta have been moving towards more of an inclusion model.
Previously, I know that when I was in elementary school, if we had coded students with some kind of disability or like medical or like ADHD or autism or something like that, oftentimes they would receive extra support, such as either an educational assistant in the classroom with them, or pullouts, or like if a student had dyslexia, they would have reading pullouts, literacy interventions. That just doesn't happen anymore in the way that it should.
Is that something that you've seen as a major issue in this labor disruption?
My understanding is that teachers support the notion of inclusion. They want these kids to be a part of the life of the school and the life of the classroom. But in order to achieve that, there need to be a greater level of supports, right? They need more educational assistance. They need more sort of tools and resources at their disposal to be able to give the support to these students that they need so that the classroom as a whole can work properly. And what we've been hearing is that teachers have become very stressed out around classroom management because of this increasing complexity in the classroom without the commensurate resources to help them manage it.
We're addressing it one way in building out an $8.6 billion spend program to build new schools. That's one thing. There's just a need for more physical space. But we also need to have more teachers to be able to have smaller classes, and we need to have more education assistants to deal with classroom complexity.
Did Danielle Smith need to use the Notwithstanding Clause for this?
Unequivocally, no. This kind of back to work legislation, this kind of interference with public sector bargaining is unfortunately far too common across the country. It's becoming even increasingly so. But as it may be common, most of the time when governments engage in this kind of interference, they'll end the strike, they'll order the workers back to work, and they'll impose binding arbitration. Then binding arbitration is not ideal. It has its own problems in terms of the labor relations dynamic, but it's at least a legitimate part of the labor relations process. The parties kind of understand it. The parties still have a role in that process. But but the government made a decision here to not do binding arbitration, which is what is the ordinary practice, and instead impose the entire agreement. They imposed their last offer. That maneuver is likely to be seen by the courts as highly unconstitutional, as a violation of the freedom of association rights of free collective bargaining. And so that's why they used the Notwithstanding Clause. But my point is that they didn't have to go that far. They could have just imposed binding arbitration. And the courts have, generally sort of seen binding arbitration as a legitimate alternative if a strike is going to be brought to an end. And so I think that's the overstep. In fact, it's a couple steps over that they needed to do in order to, if their concern was getting kids back in the classroom, they could have done that without using the sledgehammer that is the Notwithstanding Clause.
So we're talking about the Notwithstanding Clause as if it's this terrible, horrible thing, but it is a totally legal tool that the premiers can use. So why are we talking about it like it's illegal?
I think it's not so much that it's illegal, it's that it's an abomination. It's a deeply problematic tool that used to be governments would dare to touch. They just wouldn't, because it was just too politically hot, too politically fraught to be able to use it. And what we're seeing is a normalization of its use. And I think that's the problem, right? You can have a constitutional argument about whether our Charter of Rights should or shouldn't have a Notwithstanding Clause in it. But I think the core problem here, and what I think we're really looking at, is not whether it's in or not in the Constitution, it's how it's being used. And it's being used in cavalier manner that is quite troubling. Because when we think about what it's doing, it's basically saying, yes, you have a right. We are going to violate that right, but then we want to suffer no consequences for violating your right. And there may be an academic argument why there might be a need once in a blue moon to do that, to achieve a broader good. But now it's just being used as a stick to stop inconvenient voices from being able to defend their rights.
On the other hand, I mean, thousands of teachers are out of school. Hundreds of thousands of kids aren't getting education. So when you talk about the balance of if this needs to be done or not, can it not be argued that it was necessary?
Well, I guess I have a two-part answer to that. And the first answer is that no private sector employer gets to do this. This is a power that exists solely for government. And so to think about, and I'll get to why it's necessary, but like, if you think about it, the government, if you think about it like a soccer match, right? The government is one of the teams on the field. They are the referee who interprets the rules, and they're the commissioner who gets to write the playbook, or the rule book, right? And that's so different than what happens in the private sector. So when we talk about necessity, my response to that is, if they didn't have that tool at their disposal, they would have to take bargaining more seriously. They don't have to bargain to resolution because they can bargain to back to work legislation, right? So that's the first part of the answer. And I think the second part of the answer is governments always justify their back to work legislation by saying, oh, it's an emergency. We have to, that's a handy PR framing for them. But if we actually sort of ask ourselves, is 3 weeks of school being lost creating the quote unquote irreparable harm that the premier was claiming? The research is unclear about that, right? We're not necessarily sure. In 2002, when the strike was about 2 weeks old, the government attempted to declare an emergency, a public emergency, to end the strike. Well, a court justice a couple of days later, reviewed that got challenged by the union. He laughed at it. He basically said 2 weeks of missing class is not a public emergency. So this is not necessary. And so I think while obviously we need, at some point the teacher strike needed to be resolved, because we do need kids to get back into the classroom. That's an important and essential thing. The mechanisms of how we got there and why we got there, I think, are more important than, oh my goodness, it's been 3 weeks, we have to force the teachers back. There's lots of points along the way in which they could have either prevented the strike by negotiating more seriously, or they could have offered up that the teachers would have voluntarily ended their strike. I mean, I think the teachers were looking for an off-ramp for weeks, and the government just wasn't offering them.
This isn't the first time this kind of thing has been done. Back in 2022, the Ontario government used the Notwithstanding Clause to impose a new contract on education workers from the Canadian Union of Public Employees.
Premier Doug Ford is reaching for the legal tool meant as a last resort, invoking the Notwithstanding Clause to avoid a school workers' strike.
Speaker, we're making sure that the students stay in class.
This isn't the first time this has been done. Why does it seem like it's getting all of the national attention?
I think twofold. I mean, one, it's unprecedented for Alberta. And in the case of Doug Ford's efforts, within a few days, he had completely backtracked on it, repealed the legislation.
As a gesture of good faith, our government is willing to rescind the legislation.
This may be the first time that a government has successfully passed and will hold this legislation. There's a lot of different dynamics in Alberta to compare that to Ontario. But I think that's what makes the difference, I think, in this picture here, is that this may stick in a way that Doug Ford's didn't. And that becomes worrisome for setting a trend, setting a pattern of what governments can maybe get away with that, workers and unions across the country should be concerned about.
I don't need to tell you that this is one of what feels like a lot of labor action that has happened in Canada the past couple of years. I'm thinking of the postal workers, Air Canada, Montreal Metro, Quebec Dockers. Quebec doctors, BC Public Service. Are we in a period of intense labor action? And if so, why?
There's no question. We are in part of a strike wave, a strike wave of magnitude that we haven't seen since the 1980s. And I think this is very much a combination of just the events of the last few years. COVID was very stressful on everybody, obviously, but I think workers in particular felt, in many industries, just felt like their employer didn't have their back in this situation. You know, if you were a grocery worker, you saw your health being put at risk by your employer while they raked record profits. And you can see, and then it's the same thing with teachers and nurses and, you know, a wide range of different kinds of workers. And then as soon as we got out of the crisis that was COVID, we had levels of inflation we haven't seen since the 1980s. And every economist saying, well, we can't afford to increase workers' wages, but while around them, prices are going up. And so I think that just led to a level of anger and frustration and a desire for a fair deal, wanting to get a fair share of the prosperity that we're seeing, that we haven't seen in decades. And then one of the things that happens with strike waves, right, is that when one group of worker goes and their strike is successful, you know, maybe they get that wage gain or they get a fair deal from their perspective, that encourages other workers, right? They look around and they say, wow, okay, well, maybe this is actually something we can do and make this work. And that's how it sort of starts to become a bit of a wave, is that they start to follow one another because they realize it's effective. And so we're seeing it across sectors, across provinces, public sector, private sector, right? And that's because I think workers watch what what the other workers are doing, and sort of take action. So it's a very interesting kind of dynamic. I don't know whether we're still at kind of the crest of the wave or if the wave is starting to come back down. The stats make us think it's probably coming back down a little bit, but it's certainly not over yet.
And in terms of success of this strike wave, have workers been successful?
I think modestly, yeah. I mean, I think we've been seeing wage increases that we haven't seen in a couple of decades. We've seen workers win concessions out of their employers that we haven't seen. I mean, obviously not in every case. You know, the postal workers, that situation is much more complicated.
And what are some of those more creative new ways that governments are dampening these labor actions?
Well, I mean, one of the things, there's a number of tools that they're using these days. So legislatively, they're just getting more creative in terms of, instead of just sending you back to work and, you know, putting in binding arbitration, they're imposing agreements. They're setting wage caps ahead of time, like before even negotiations start. They'll say no one's allowed to have a wage, increase above 1%, right? And they just kind of impose that across the public sector even before negotiations start. A number of provinces, including Alberta and British Columbia, have established a bargaining coordination office that basically coordinates bargaining across the sector in order to make sure that everything looks the same. Alberta's even gone as far as to implement secret mandates, where the government mandates every single public sector employer what agreement they're allowed to settle on. But no one's allowed to talk about it. The employer can't tell them that it's a mandate, right? But it has had profound impacts on how bargaining has played out in the last few years in Alberta. And in the other way in which they sometimes just go straight at unions. Alberta's done this. Quebec is now just introduced legislation to do this, to interfere with the internal workings of unions.
Unions in Quebec are outraged over a new bill that would allow workers to opt out of paying some of their union dues. They are calling it an assault on workers' rights.
So there's all these creative ways that premiers and governments are getting around labor action and squashing it. Can you put the toothpaste back in the tube? Like, is this the end of effective labor action in Canada? Because it feels grim.
It is grim. I mean, especially if living in Alberta this week, given, events of the last 10 days or so, it feels very grim. But this is my response to this, is there is a way to put the toothpaste back in the tube, but at least kind of gather the toothpaste up and start a new tube. And the model might be what we saw in this past summer with the Air Canada flight attendants. So they got ordered back to work by the federal minister. Air Canada had been refusing to negotiate with them because they just assumed they'd get ordered back to work, and Air Canada would get its way. And the flight attendants just said, no, we're not going back. We're going to stay out. And if you notice, it just destabilized everything. The government kind of freaked out. Air Canada kind of freaked out. And a couple days later, they had a deal.
Thank you so much for giving us your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me anytime.
We want to hear the other side of this story, and we have put in an interview request with Dimitrios Nikolaidis, Alberta's Minister of Education. We hope to bring you that conversation next week. There's always so much politics news to keep up with, so we have got Noor, who has been keeping tabs on what you should know. She's with us to fill us in. Noor, what's going on?
Hey.
The budget is dropping tomorrow, and just for our listeners, we are recording this on Monday afternoon. What are you looking for in it?
Okay, here's what we know. So far, not a single party has said that they are going to support the budget. In the lead up, Mark Carney's been on a little charm tour, meeting with Yves-François Blanchet, Elizabeth May, Don Davies, Pierre Poilievre. He did this kind of like weird photo op series that looked like the world's most awkward dating montage to try to get the leaders on side before the budget drops. But so far, we have no explicit takers. There's been some kind of posturing from the NDP that they might abstain, but really nothing is confirmed yet.
That is not great. That can trigger an election.
Look, yes, we're not in the best shape possible for a budget to go through. And yes, there could be a confidence vote, by mid-November when MPs return to Ottawa. But Mark Carney just needs to get 3 people from any party on side to pass this budget.
3 people? That's it.
Yes, that's it. But it could be a bit harder to get 3 votes than it really sounds. MPs usually vote in blocks. So the NDP usually votes all together. The Conservatives vote all together. The Bloc Québécois does the same. And Elizabeth May votes on her own, I guess. So getting 3 individual votes may not be as easy as it sounds. People do break away from their parties, but it's rare that happens.
So it's just kind of who blinks first.
Yeah. His other option is to kind of pray to the big man upstairs, GOD, that a few
you were talking
opposition...
about Trump. Oh, my God. You're talking about God.
The other big man upstairs.
The other big man upstairs.
Above the clouds, not the other big man. Yeah, he just has to pray that a few opposition MPs just, forget to show up to work that day or, get sick and don't show up to the vote.
Love that strategy.
Yeah, not a very effective one, but he could also, govern like a leader, make some concessions to other parties, work together like other minority governments are supposed to.
So they need these votes from the other parties, but what specifically are the NDP and the Bloc and the Conservatives looking for in the budget?
Yeah, the Bloc is very, very focused on this pension plan for seniors. The NDP is very, focused on the social supports and social services. Conservatives want cuts. They want an austerity budget. So, no random spending for the school lunch program, the social services that we have come to enjoy.
Okay, so we don't know if the budget will pass. Do we have any idea what is going to be in it?
Well, Mark Carney made a national address last week.
I want to make this promise to Canadians. I will always be straight about the challenges that we face and the choices that we must make. And to be clear, we won't transform our economy easily or in a few months. It will take some sacrifices. And it will take some time.
Oh my God, that sounds like a wartime thing.
Yeah, no, he's definitely prepping us for a budget that we may not like.
All right, we are setting the expectations low. We are expecting very high deficits, a lot of cuts, new spending.
Yeah, pretty much all of the above. We're expecting a higher deficit than last year, plus a big, big bump in defense spending. You know, Canada finally promised to hit the NATO 2% GDP target by March, and 3.5% by 2035. So
lots of military/defense spending, I can imagine.
Lots. And there's also been this kind of steady drumbeat of pre-budget announcements since June. Defense spending, housing spending, nuclear reactor spending, some jobs reskilling, and even $77 million for the CRA to crack down on trucking industry tax dodgers. So
okay, there's gonna be some weird stuff in there.
Yeah, lots of weird stuff. Oh, and remember, the budget is going to look different this year.
Right, they are splitting it up. We talked about this before, operational spending and capital spending, and they're only doing one a year.
Correct. And again, I know that sounds boring, but it does actually matter. It'll make clear what is the kind of day-to-day spending of our government versus long-term investments that we may not see the return on for a few years down the line.
And you know, I will be in that room reading the budget with everybody else. So let's move on. I don't want to think about this until I have to tomorrow.
What do you mean? You're not so excited about the budget dropping?
I am excited. There's going to be major drama.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on. The Supreme Court made a pretty controversial ruling last week.
Controversial in what way?
Well, they struck down mandatory minimum sentences for accessing or possessing child pornography, and they basically ruled that the 1-year minimum prison sentence was unconstitutional. It was a close vote, 5-4 split on the bench.
Okay, I am going to need some more context for that decision.
Totally fair. Told you it's a controversial one, so let's get into it. The court was asked to decide whether the 1-year minimum violates the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, specifically the part in the Charter that protects against cruel and unusual punishment.
Okay, so why did people say it was unconstitutional?
A justice who wrote the majority opinion, so what they ended up deciding, said basically these laws capture accessing or possessing child pornography, captures a huge range of situations. You know, on the one end, you've got the severe organized offenders, you know, the ones hoarding thousands of images over years and data drives in their basement. And on the other hand, you could have, say, an 18-year-old who gets sent an explicit picture of a 17-year-old without ever asking for it, and then it just keeps it for a day.
Right, so it's the same charge, but totally different circumstances. Still, it sounds weird.
It does. But the problem with this law, the justice says, is that the mandatory minimum just doesn't leave judges room to make that distinction. It's like this one-size-fits-all punishment, but judges can still punish sex offenders. Let's be clear here. The mandatory minimum just doesn't give them the flexibility to rule to the unique needs of each individual case.
Okay, and I can imagine that there was a lot of reaction from this.
Yeah, I told you it was controversial at the start. It was a very controversial ruling. You know, Doug Ford said that the government should use the Notwithstanding Clause to override it. Danielle Smith in Alberta said the same thing. And then Pierre Poilievre did as well.
So this ruling is wrong-headed, and I would oppose the ruling, and I would use the Notwithstanding Clause to overturn it.
Okay, Notwithstanding Clause, really on the menu these days.
Really on the menu these days. Yep.
All right, what else you got? Oh, I know what you got. You went to go see Pierre in person.
I did. Confirmed he's a short king, but I did see him in person.
That was your first time seeing him in real life?
That was my first time seeing him in real life, yes.
Nice. Okay, so why did you spend your Thursday evening with him?
Because in the lead up to the election, there was so much youth, Gen Z, Zoomer energy behind Poilievre. He was undeniably Gen Z's leader. And this was a youth-focused event. So I wanted to see if that still rang true. Are young people still riding for Pierre Poilievre? And if so, like, why?
Yeah, so you went to Jamil Javani's event, which kind of had the same vibe. And that one was, like, undoubtedly pretty lame. Like, not a big turnout. What was this one like?
This was totally different. The room was packed. There were countless MPs from Ottawa sitting in the front row. The energy was, like, quite honestly electric. And I can't give it all away because there's a full episode dropping Friday. But let's just say he's still got the Gen Z sauce. And I think the Conservatives are doing something that no other party is trying to do right now.
Okay, I will be tuning in Friday to hear about your soiree with Poilievre. Bye.
Bye.
All right, that is everything for today. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And just a reminder, if you could like this video, hit subscribe, share it with a friend. Be super appreciated. See you next week.